rocket-propelled grenade hit this tree, essentially exploded, and I was in the fireball. You know, like I remember just there was this white flash and this incredible heat.
When your first combat tour and your first deployment as an officer coincide, there's a lot of learning on the fly. Everything that you learn or that you do on that first deployment will influence the rest of your career, for better or for worse. Besides finding out just how much you can endure and whether you'll crack under the pressure, you also get to find out whether you really have everything it takes to be a leader.
You know, the guys we're up against are for real, and this is not going to be easy. This is not a game. This is not an adventure, you know, and we're definitely not in training anymore.
What is true bravery? What makes a hero a hero? Tested by the worries of what's happening at home, thousands of miles away, and the reality of what you're facing here and now. When your life is in danger every second, and it's either kill or be killed. From Wondery and Incongruity Media, this is Anthony Russo, and this is War. Ray McPadden had spent 15 long, difficult months in Afghanistan, leading a 10th Mountain Division platoon and learning the hard way why the Korengal Valley enjoyed the reputation it did. Once he made it to Iraq, the clarity of the raids and the elegance of their execution made perfect sense to him. While we don't really think of the Army Rangers as having it easy, it took joining the premier raid force in the world for McPadden to find his calling.
What the battalion was doing in Iraq, it was very different from what was going on in Afghanistan. It was in central Iraq, Baghdad, north to Tikrit. They were going after bad guys who were living in houses and compounds, you know, every night. We had a lot better intelligence. It was a very different battlefield. And physically, it was much easier. You know, we'd roll out in Stryker vehicles like every night and go hit targets and then go back to base and hang out, and guys would work on their tans. And I remember we were in a Stryker, and General McChrystal, who was I think in charge of the Joint Special Operations Command at the time, was right across from me in the Stryker. He went out with us. He went out with a Ranger platoon on target. So I remember it was like, man, the commander of everything is sitting right across from me in the Stryker, you know? And I was still like pretty like just strung out from the whole tour in Afghanistan. And I remember going and hitting this target. It's in this little village in Iraq, and we drove Strykers and we parked outside the village somewhere, and we all dismounted and went in on foot quietly in the dark. We surrounded this house. You know, they sort of heard us coming over the wall, and, you know, guys grabbed their guns inside, and we just started blowing people away. Killed 2 guys inside this house. And I just remember thinking like, man, we've got all the advantages here, you know? We know where the bad guys are. We have them surrounded. We have aircraft overhead. Like, we are kicking their fucking ass. And it felt really, really good to just go out and just have all the tactical advantages. We've got darkness, speed, surprise, violence of action, and we have aircraft overhead. And I was like, wow, this is the war I thought I was going to the first time.
That first tour in Afghanistan probably had broken him, but he didn't really know it once he transitioned into the Ranger Battalion and started doing these hits in Iraq. It's funny because of how desperate he had been to go to Afghanistan instead of Iraq. But his early career was filled with snap decisions, like when he went from being a student who was ambivalent about being in the ROTC at Texas A&M to considering dropping out so he could go fight on September 12, 2001.
I went into our instructors there for the Corps Cadets program, and I said, I want to get in the fight, and, you know, I want to do it now. And I think I don't want to go to the officer program. I just want to go enlist. And, you know, he told me, what just happened is going to set things in motion, and we are going to be fighting likely for a long time. you need to be on the officer track, finish your degree, and go in as a lieutenant. Don't go be a private right now.
So he didn't. He went to airborne school and then to ranger school and then on to Afghanistan, where he learned that being tough and being fit isn't all you need to be an infantry officer. You need to learn to help guys dig down when they don't think they can and to make accommodations when they can't. Kicking down doors with the Rangers couldn't have been any more different than slogging through the mountains of Afghanistan and trying to manage these different levels of abilities. And it was that difference in ability that started to give him a little bit more perspective on the tour that he had just finished.
Afghanistan and the conventional army, it was a totally different thing where we were constantly ill-supplied. We were sort of remote and isolated out there in the mountains. And so it was just a completely different war to go to Iraq with a special operations unit compared to going to Afghanistan with a conventional unit. And we went in, that first target I went on with the Rangers. Yeah, we just mopped the floor with these dudes. And then, an hour later we were like back at our base. Like, that was fun. That was cool. Let's do that again. I think the most memorable thing was feeling like we had all the advantages. And there's this sense of power that stuck with me of, we have a lot of guns and these guys are operating at a totally different level. Nobody's going to quit in a movement in the Rangers, right? That actually happened to us in the 10th Mountain. Like a guy got too broke off and he just flopped on his back on a patrol and was like, I can't do it. I can't go anymore.
Back in the Afghanistan mountains with that private lying on the ground saying he couldn't go another step, McPadden was of two minds. His first instinct was to grab the man by the collar and just drag him back to camp. Instead, he just threatened to leave the man for the Taliban. But then he remembered his training. He didn't need to be told not to leave his soldier on the field. That's not the training he was thinking of. The training that came to mind was when he was in ranger school and his temper and impatience first revealed themselves as his own enemy. As they pitched in and grabbed the guy's gear to help him down the mountain, he remembered the time he'd reached the end of his own rope.
Probably the hardest thing was, the starvation. And I'd never experienced that before, like real hunger, day in, day out, like pain in your stomach, dizziness, the exhaustion that comes with limited caloric intake and huge expenditure of energy. Sort of in my head, I thought, like, I'm an infantry officer and I'm ready for this. And I remember my evals, I was right on the border where if I would have been just a tiny bit lower, I would have actually been, I think, recycled or sent to another squad. So I almost got like peered out. Basically, you get voted off the island, right? Like your other people in your squad say you're a turd. That was a huge wake-up call for me.
The hunger had given him a foul attitude, and attitude is critical because it's infectious. There aren't any ranks in Ranger School, so the guy sitting next to you could be a private or a sergeant or a lieutenant. Everyone has the same status, and that status is they're not yet Rangers. McPadden knew that toughness was a given for a Ranger and that there was a huge difference between being tough and being superior. Superiority more is connected to the way you comport yourself and the dignity with which you face adversity. He reminded himself that. He knew he had to leave with optimism. He also reminded himself that he hadn't ended up with this assignment. This was an assignment he fought to get.
I saw my unit assignment and I thought, no, this isn't going to work for me. I want to go to Afghanistan. I want to get in the fight. I want to go where, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the real bad guys, I want to go after them and I want to do it now. I remember I went into the S1, the Division S1's office, Fulberg Colonel, I think. And I said, hey, my orders, I want to change them. And she, she just like looked at me like, are you on drugs? And who are you? You're a second lieutenant. Like, Jesus, Maybe it was just the audacity of what I was doing. She was like, what do you want? And she probably hears so much like guys trying to get out of deployments that for her to say, I don't like the fact that I may not get deployed for a while. And if when I do, it's going to be to Iraq. That's not going to work for me. I want to go to Afghanistan. I want to go now. Right then and there, she changed my orders and sent me to a unit that was gearing up to leave to Afghanistan in like 2 or 3 months. And so that was 132 Infantry, 10th Mountain Division.
For better or worse, there's always a little tension when a college kid takes over a platoon. Rank has two levels of respect in the military. The first one is based on rank and pretty much arbitrary. It's not just about how you carry yourself on the battlefield. It's also about how the way you choose to lead reflects your personality. It's a subtle but important point that you're not a phony, that your leadership style is directly connected to your personality. That way, the people that you're leading believe that your decisions are genuine, even when they don't love the way they go.
So a lot of those kids that were deployed, with me in that first tour I had in Afghanistan, they had never been tested like that. And then just the sheer duration of it, I don't think any of us were really ready for. Even the guys who'd been deployed to Afghanistan before, some of the more senior sergeants were just not. It was just what we were doing was pretty bold and pretty audacious, and it was incredibly tiring. We went into Konar province and took ground in the Shuriak and Korangal valleys. We did this big offensive movement and essentially picked a big-ass fight with the enemy.
McPadden and the other 10th Mountain guys could measure their marches in vertical feet as they pushed outwards, trying to establish a buffer between the Afghan fighters and the nearby villages. They were helping establish an outpost that, a few years later, would be named for Private Juan Restrepo, killed in action there in 2007 and memorialized in the eponymous film. This outpost, actually this whole section, is famously exposed. McPadden talked about the terror and the pride standing out in the open for re-enlistment ceremonies and commendation and award presentations. They were always waiting for a sniper to attack, but whether the sniper attacked or not was immaterial. Their presence there was a way of stating to the enemy that the Americans were there and that they were not leaving. If anyone wanted to pick a fight, they knew just where the Americans could be found.
They came into positions on a sort of the shoulder of a mountain and lined up at about 3 a.m. and hit us very hard with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. I was asleep at the time. I was just in my sleeping bag, and I remember we were all kind of sleeping in the dirt in this little patrol base. And I remember, just immediately waking up. It was obvious very quickly that we were in a big firefight. The accuracy of the enemy fire at 3 a.m. was, I remember I was like, how in the hell are they doing this? They're pretty far up the hill. It was plunging fire. And they didn't have night optics. They didn't have IR and lasers and all that. And I just thought, how in the hell are these guys doing this? It was a real wake-up call for me of these dudes really have their shit together. They're not a bunch of cherry fighters. They probably don't have some cherry-ass lieutenant like me leading their patrol. These dudes have their shit together. And it was sort of exciting to have been in the first big combat engagement, and everybody, nobody was actually wounded or killed. And so it was this kind of it was this bonding moment for the platoon of we were in the shit, man. That was intense. And there was also this deep sense of dread of oh my God, these dudes are for real. The guys we're up against are for real. And this is not going to be easy. This is not a game.
Driving off that assault was a huge morale booster for the guys, but there were another 15 months left in front of them of near constant combat. The shine would come off pretty quickly once the casualties started piling up. And it wasn't just the Taliban. The mountains provided opportunities for ankle breaks and getting lost and getting sick and falling down, and they would become as much an enemy as the Afghans over the next couple months. The best the guys of the 10th Mountain could do was just keep pushing forward. I love that Dollar Shave Club has everything I need to look, feel, and smell my best. But what I love even more is the fact that I never have to go to a store. That's because 1, DSC delivers everything I need right to my door, and 2, they keep me fully stocked on what I use so I don't run out. Here's how it works. Dollar Shave Club has everything you need to get ready no matter what you're getting ready for. They have you covered head to toe for your hair, your skin, your face, you name it, they have it. And they have this new program where they automatically keep you stocked up on the products you use. You determine what you want and when you want it, and it shows up right at your door from once a month to once every 6 months. For example, I go through about a bottle of Amber Lavender body cleanser every 4 months, so getting an automatic order just makes sense. But the best part is I still get a monthly reminder when my order is set to ship. That way I can add it if I go through it faster or decide to try out something else, like maybe the DSC toothpaste. Plus, with their handsome discount, the more you buy, the more you save. And right now they've got a bunch of starter sets you can try for just $5, like their oral care kit. After that, the restock box ships regular sized products at a regular price, so what are you waiting for? Get your starter set right now for $5 at dollarshaveclub.com/thisiswar. That's dollarshaveclub.com/thisiswar. dollarshaveclub.com/thisiswar. It was more than a month into their deployment, and McPadden still hadn't found the right leadership balance. He hadn't found his confidence yet. He didn't have a desire to be like one of the guys, but he also didn't want to remain completely aloof. He'd led well enough during the attacks, and he was professionally confident, but he was still looking for a way to make a better connection with his men. And oddly, it was a crack in his professional exterior that earned him a spot in the platoon.
We hadn't been into a chow hall in several weeks. We'd been sort of eating MREs and living in the field, and we were all dirty and we stunk. And I remember I had a little 4-pack of Oreos or something like that. And me and the medic were sitting together, and I just took the top, you do the little twist on the Oreo to try to get a good separation on it. And I remember I got a good separation. And I held it up to the medic, and I was like, sweet, I don't know what it was about this little thing, but, he kind of looked at me and was like, you're all right, sir, or something like that. And I thought, he sort of, the medic accepted me, and he was, a very respected figure in the platoon, the super tough kid. It was after that first firefight and sort of, all going back and sort of having the pressure off, and we're all in this little dining hall together, sort of this big dirty infantry platoon comes into the field and is just indulging ourselves in candy and junk. And it was, that was sort of when I felt like I was I'm a real platoon leader now.
Spring kicks off the real fighting season in Afghanistan, and it requires particular vigilance. Although the Afghan fighters often were too far away to fire, they weren't too far away to observe, and carelessness on the part of the new leader was something that they were willing to exploit. Basic tactics say to move your patrol base every 24 hours when you're out in the field, but McPadden and his team had inserted into a place that was easy enough to defend and close enough to the resupply line, so he decided to settle in for 3 or 4 days. The enemy made him pay.
We were in our patrol base, and the enemy got the drop on us, and they came after us, and it was a very well-organized attack. It was very effective. They essentially had machine gun positions at about 200 or 300 meters out. And then they had another element come in and get in really, really, really close. And where we were in essentially grenade range, we were throwing grenades at the enemy. Me and one of my sergeants had a position. He was sort of on the left side of this tree, and I was on the right side of this tree. And in the course of that, a rocket-propelled grenade hit this tree and essentially exploded, and there was this white flash and this incredible heat. We were in the fireball and in the concussion, in the shockwave of it. We fought back, and I remember feeling like I was very lucid and in control. I was wounded, and I was really not able to move very well. Some of the shrapnel was in my leg. The medic, or the same medic, Vaccaro, the kid that I had the little moment with the Oreo with, he was like, hey, you're wounded. You need to get evac'd. I was already calling in a medevac for the 2 other guys, right? And I didn't really even realize how, that I was wounded until he looked at me after the firefight. Is all, adrenaline. I was like, I got fucking blown up, but I think I'm okay. I'm not my leg's not sitting on the side of the mountain or anything. So I was like, no, I'm good. And he's like, no, you need to get evac'd. And I remember having this big argument with the medic, but I was like, dude, I am not calling in my own fucking medevac, doc. That's the most chicken shit thing you could do. You're right, doc. I really can't move very well, but I want to stay through the night because we think the enemy's coming back.
The enemy didn't return, and the next day McPadden hitched a ride out with the supply helicopter. He was sent on to Germany to be patched up and returned for a few weeks before heading home on his mid-tour leave. He was anxious to see his wife Elizabeth, who'd been his high school sweetheart and remains his wife to this day. But he wasn't prepared to feel the disconnect between how desperately he loved being home and the certainty that he needed to get back in the fight, and what that would likely mean.
It felt really good to see my wife. I mean, it was incredible. And I just, realized how important she was to me. As I started to get through that mid-tour leave, I started to think about actually going back. And I was pretty convinced that, maybe I'll die, but something bad is going to happen. I'm going to lose a leg. And I tried so hard to keep that away from her. And then one interesting sort of piece of this, like a little aside, is I remember me and her we were back in our hometown. We saw some old friends. And I remember we were like at a bar, and they were like trying to get me. They were, it was kind of like, hey, so what's it like? You get those like silly questions. They're like sort of huge and open-ended. But they were like good friends, and I wanted to answer. And I did. I tried to tell them a couple war stories about firefights and dropping we dropped the mortar. And I remember seeing this mortar come in and actually hit a bad guy. Afterwards, I felt like cheap. I felt like I was just like a little dancing monkey. Like, they're like, yeah, tell some war stories. And I was like, yeah, there's my war stories. And I don't know, I felt stupid afterward. I just felt like they didn't really get it. How a lot of it felt. And it was kind of like cheap laughs over beers at a bar. The deeper effect of it all was just completely lost on them, and so none of it's their fault.
The trouble wasn't just that he couldn't communicate the depth of his experience, but that was a part of it. It was just that talking about the action belied the drudgery, the radical temperatures, the relentlessness of the constant firefights and the danger and the fear. Most of all, though, no amount of stories about killing bad guys makes up for the sense of loss when it's your own guys who are part of someone else's war stories.
And we actually had casualties while I was on leave. I remember I saw our sergeant major and he was actually going out on leave. He was like, sit down for this. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, no, this is something bad happened. And he was like, some of your guys got killed. And one of them was our medic. His name is Vaccaro, Doc Vaccaro. Yeah, he got his head blown off by a rocket-propelled grenade, and super ugly way to die. I think the first half of the tour, I was trying to win the war. I was trying to kill as many of the enemy as we could. And I think the second half, I sort of approached as, we're going to carry out our mission, but I don't want anybody to die. I can do things, incredibly aggressive things, and I might kill a few more bad guys. But ultimately, I started to become, a little jaded about the overall impact it would have. The safety of your men is not always the first and foremost priority. That's not how you win a battle, and that's not how you win a war. It's first and foremost, nobody should get killed. That's absolutely the wrong fucking answer. So, I mean, I'm saying that, I'm not saying this lightly at all, that I had this shift in mentality.
Of course, not being aggressive is different from being just a little bit more careful. It's important to recognize that out there on that ridge, guys were being shot through their tents at night or while they were walking into the chow hall. Keeping the enemy back was a clear and a crucial part of the fight, as well as an important way to keep the soldiers safe. As the tour got extended and the casualties piled up, the difficulty for McPadden was more about morale than anything else.
And we were always out there, and you were always exposed. And at any given time, the enemy, at least where we were, they were always maneuvering. I mean, guys were getting shot while they were like sleeping, in the outpost. And guys were like eating breakfast and they were getting shot, And every time you left the wire, it was a hump, man. It was down 1,000 feet and across this fast-moving mountain river and up another 3,000 vertical feet. And then, you get shot at. So it was just incredibly exhausting, and you were never fresh. You just got a little more tired every day until you were in this zombie-like state, and that's how you fought.
Although he would get home safe and go on to ranger selection and then on to doing missions with the battalion, this was where the seeds for the end of McPadden's career were planted. The morale problems just kept getting worse as the cold and the relentless gunfights and the treacherous terrain took its toll. This is when guys started quitting. McPadden calls it shell shock. After all, post is the first word in PTSD, and they weren't post anything. They were still in it, and he had promised himself that he'd not lose another man to the mountain or to the Afghan fighters. Of course, that wasn't his choice to make.
I think we had very different mentality in that last 3 months than we did in the first year. Took great reserves of energy, and it was hard, because the default was really, feel sorry for yourself, like, poor me. How could they do this to us? It was there was a lot of pissing and moaning, and in my head and in the platoon, and I just did my very best to be positive and to try to avoid unnecessary risk and tactical blunders. We did have a guy get killed, though, after we got extended. It was a recoilless rifle. The enemy shot a recoilless rifle, sort of an anti-tank weapon, and hit a wall in a house. And this kid, Wilson, was sitting on the other side of the wall. And so it just, it was just a catastrophic shot.
McPadden wouldn't miss the trials of the Hindu Kush Range or the fighting in Afghanistan he had so wanted to get into. He was home a little more than a month when he had the opportunity to go to Ranger selection. From there, he was participating in hits all over Iraq and then coming home to train and then going back to do it again. But Afghanistan wasn't done with him. When he finally returned to that place in the Korangal Valley a few years later, he would find it much different than he had left it, and it would change him. His time in Iraq had gotten him used to winning, but McPadden was starting to feel the weight of that first tour in Afghanistan. Part of it was him finding his feet as a leader, learning to watch your soldiers under near constant fire and dealing with the casualties and morale and the other guys' exhaustion. But the other part of it is that Afghanistan had weakened his resolve. It had introduced fear and a little bit of doubt he was constantly working to shake off. When he got word they'd be returning to the Korangal Valley, though, he was more interested than apprehensive. After all, he already knew his way around and even recalled some of the villages from his tour pretty fondly.
We essentially had a target, and this target was a house where I knew the people, I knew the family from my first tour. It was all very personal that first time around because you were living amongst the population, you were living with the tribes day in, day out, and by no means were all of them hostile, but winter was coming in and it was raining and we were sort of exposed to the elements and it was cold. And I remember they let us stay there in the village, I gave them a little money. It was like the Pashtunwali, right? Like their code of, be nice to your guests, and the kids hung out with us. Like all the village kids were so fascinated by us. And, we were truly living in this village. And we did it for a while, and I won't say they accepted us. I will say that they most definitely tolerated us. We were tight with a lot of them. We became tight with a lot of people, and the adults and the sort of young adults that I got to know they were just real people with like real problems and the same like wants and needs that anybody has here in the U.S.
There's really no need or even a point in sugarcoating what McPadden was doing as part of the Ranger Regiment. They were kicking down doors and shooting or grabbing up bad guys. It's as simple as that. But as they prepared to hit this house, a house he knew well in a neighborhood where he had spent a significant amount of time during that 15 months, McPadden wasn't afraid. But maybe he was a little embarrassed, either of his past self or of his present self. It's hard to know which.
So I'm not sure how much I should say. I can just say that I ran into some people that I'd seen when they were younger. And now they had essentially become, I think, fighters. And there was one guy in particular that we had in a room, and I knew him, like we were friends. 3.5 years earlier. Like, I considered him. I was like, you're our friend. Like, you come with us, you hang with us. You're part of, I think, the allied effort here. And he was essentially a bad guy on a target. And I remember we had him, and there's this sense where you want to be like, hey man, like, what's up? High five, like, I remember me. I don't know. I'm oversimplifying. I remember hiding from this guy. I didn't want him to see me. Because I thought if he sees me, he'll recognize me. And then I don't know. It's not like it would be like, oh, now you have to let me go because you know me. That's not the case at all. I mean, we were going to do what we wanted to do to this guy. But I just remember thinking, I can't let him see me. And I don't know exactly why I felt that way. I hid from this guy. I went to great length to make sure he did not see my face or recognize me. And maybe, yeah, there was some sort of weird bond that we had from the first time, where it's like, even though you're in a war and you're doing your job and you're part of the American military and you said you have this cold distance from, I think, the locals. I mean, it's impossible not to be human and develop some relationships with them. So I felt very, I don't know, I felt guilty about what we were doing. Even though he was, I think our intelligence was credible and very real, but I felt guilty about what we had done, about this raid and shooting people in his village. And,
This place, this small section of the Korengal Valley had churned out little more than acts of courage and cowardice, of gains and losses on both sides. 3 years before, McPadden had soldiers quit, broken while hiking it. In 2009, as the new offensive started, there had even been more death and carnage in recent months. Hiding his face, probably as much to prevent the prisoner from having a false sense of hope as to avoid the sense of mutual betrayal, McPadden pretty much knew he was done as a ranger.
One of the things I realized carrying out some of these missions in the same area was that very little had changed, and our sense of like progress and results, you work on it for a couple years and boom, it's good. It's going to be good. You win. So I think that it became real to me going back to the same place and seeing how little had changed and seeing that some of the people that I think were maybe even allies the first time around had now become our targets. I just had this wake up moment, and that really helped solidify the decision to get out and do other things. I certainly didn't get out being like, oh, I'm mad at the military and I'm anti-war now. Nothing like that at all. I just thought, it's time for me to do other things.
The last decade pretty much had gotten away from him. McPadden had a degree from a great school, but he'd spent more time training and in combat than he had spent as a husband, let alone an employee. In retrospect, it shouldn't have surprised him as much as it did that combat experience wasn't as sought after a skill as he had hoped. It was going to be a tough transition.
I got out, and I remember thinking I could get any job I want. In my head, I'm a war hero. And I got out, and like it was really hard. The transition out was not easy at all. It was sort of hard to get a job that I wanted. And I think a lot of people, the whole PTSD and the crazy vets thing, we were sort of broken victims, and people were not, there was, I think, a lot of respect for the military, but it just didn't feel like I was able to get out and find something really meaningful for me. Just being an infantry officer and having a really impressive combat resume, was not necessarily a skill set that a lot of, companies or organizations, even government wanted.
If veterans learn nothing else, it's how to not quit. A lot of times they just have to remember that when they get home. That's what McPadden did. He got his master's degree and went to work as a backcountry ranger in the national parks. He had been pretty sure the war was most of the way behind him, though, when it all came back at once.
I was actually in the mountains in Colorado skiing, and at one of the ski areas nearby, they were doing avalanche control. So they were shooting howitzers at the slopes, and the explosion releases an avalanche, right? And I didn't expect it. It sort of, the sound of the explosions, I didn't know it was coming. So to suddenly hear artillery explosions and the echo of it in the mountains, and to sort of have it happen by surprise, holy shit, man. I was back on the battlefield in the Korengal Valley, and I was just, all these emotions came pouring out, and I went back home and started writing stuff down.
Although he's unable to share a lot of the details of his service, he decided to recount his Afghanistan experience in a book called And the Whole Mountain Burned. Mostly, though, he thinks about the ambivalence that comes with being a ranger. He loves his country and he loved fighting, and he's proud of everything that he did. But in the end, looking around at those villages in Afghanistan and seeing that they were at least the same, if not worse, than when he had found them, he thought that he could better serve himself and his family and his country back home as a civilian. His writing helped him to come to terms with the decisions he made and the decisions he failed to make, and the people he was able to save, and the people that he wasn't, on both sides of the mountain. This is the last show of our first season, and we here at This Is War just wanted to take a second to thank everyone who shared their stories and to all of you who've listened to them. It means a lot to us that these stories get told, and your support is invaluable in that. We'll be back in the new year with more compelling stories. In the meanwhile, enjoy your holiday, take a second to think of the men and women who are spending it deployed away from home, and have a fantastic new year. Are you a combat veteran, or do you know one with a story to tell? Reach out to us at stories@thisiswar.com with your dates and branch of service, as well as a brief description of the experience that you would like to share. If you like the show, you can help support us by visiting our sponsors or by leaving a 5-star review wherever you're listening right now. This Is War was written by me, Anthony Russo, and produced by Incongruity Media. Executive producer Hernan Lopez for Wondery.